So my concept is earthly politics. And this concept contests an idea that's been really central to political theory in the West, really since its beginning in ancient Greece. And that's the idea that the political domain is an exclusively human one. This idea runs so deep even now that, for many of us, it just seems nonsensical to talk about the relationship between human beings and non-human parts of the earth or parts of nature as a political relationship. And yet, non-human beings and things are everywhere subject to the coercive forces of states and other political bodies and to the political will of democratic majorities. Political power regulates how the non-human things that we think of as natural resources are extracted and distributed and disposed of, how the animals that live among us are produced and slaughtered and studied, and how the earth itself is divided up and populated and protected or not. Our relationship to Earth's non-human parts is thoroughly infused with political power. It reflects our political values. It's constitutive of our political communities. One way to describe this relationship that we have with nature, this political relationship, at least as it now stands, is domination. When I say we here, I mean average citizens in ostensibly democratic societies like this one. And what I mean by domination is that non-human beings and things are vulnerable in a structural or systematic way to human power that's insufficiently constrained and exploitative or not responsive to the well-being of those it affects. Because human beings are also a part of nature, nature's a contested term, that's for sure. I'm using it in a broad way here to include the many beings and things that populate or comprise Earth systems. So because people are also a part of that, a part of nature in that sense, the unchecked exploitative power that human beings are permitted to exercise in relation to nature's non-human parts, this unchecked exploitative power circles back to entrap and exploit people too. Although, of course, it does this in different ways and to different degrees, depending on where people fall in human hierarchies. So the political relationship between people and the earth as it now stands in most ostensibly democratic societies is characterized by what I'm calling environmental domination. Earthly politics is a way out of or a way beyond or a passage to something different. And I'm going to start by saying something about why earthly politics matters, meaning why an ethos of care for the earth isn't enough, important as it is. And then I'm going to say a little bit about what an earthly politics might look like. And there I'm going to focus on two aspects of earthly politics: the limitation of human power and the political incorporation of non-human parts of nature. I'm going to talk about two modes of earthly politics: institutions and activism. And I'm going to talk about two sensibilities or virtues of earthly politics: political respect for nature and eco-responsibility. The objective of earthly politics is to interrupt the dynamics of environmental domination and to create more emancipatory forms of political relationship, both between human beings and non-human parts of nature and among people. Okay, so first, why earthly politics matters. Environmental stewardship as an ethical practice of ecological care is in lots and lots of ways an admirable thing. But it doesn't solve the fundamental problem, which is domination. That is nature's condition of systematic vulnerability to human power that's insufficiently constrained and exploitative. Domination in this sense isn't the same thing as omnipotence or perfect control over nature. Earth systems quite clearly elude human efforts at control in all kinds of ways, from climate change to superbugs to cascading collapses of ecosystems. Domination isn't about perfect control. It's about power that lacks effective institutional constraints and that's not responsive to the well-being of those it affects. Domination instrumentalizes some to satisfy the unchecked purposes of others. And because domination is a systematic or systemic or structural condition of vulnerability, meaning no formal apparatus of constraint and responsiveness, because it's a structural condition, it often comes apart from the intentions that particular people have. So, for instance, insofar as I'm permitted to poison the earth, the soil with pesticides, the land that I farm and the non-human populations that live there, they're vulnerable to me in a way that doesn't change simply because as an individual farmer, I decide to go organic. Likewise, one US administration opting not to open up Anwar to oil drilling doesn't mitigate the basic status condition of that land relative to the domination of American public power, as long as the next administration is free to do it. So domination isn't about omnipotence or perfect control, and it's a systematic condition of vulnerability that can come apart from the intentions of particular people. We can think about environmental domination in this sense as a multifaceted phenomenon that includes the political, economic, and cultural forces through which human beings dominate nature, understood as Earth's more than human parts, and are themselves dominated in terms of both the special burdens that are placed on poor and marginalized people with respect to environmental harms, and also the ways that virtually all of us, even privileged people in the world's most affluent societies, the ways that all of us are confined and exploited by human forces that degrade the earth, often in our names and with our not always willing participation. Consider the iron-like inescapability of the environmentally damaging practices that sustain daily life for all of us in modern societies, from energy and transportation systems dependent on fossil fuels, to the toxic industrialized food supply, to the ubiquitous presence of pharmaceuticals and plastics and forever chemicals. Opting out of these practices and their effects is just not a live option for most people. Our entrapment reflects the fact that modern life is structured by forms of power that are insufficiently checked and not adequately responsive to the well-being of those they affect. They reflect domination in that sense. And our entrapment is compounded by our exploitation insofar as the systems we cannot escape and do not control regularly instrumentalize us by compromising our land, air, water, and bodies for the purpose of generating profits for corporations and power for the political officials who serve them. So I don't mean to say that the harms of environmental domination affect everyone in the same way or to the same degree. That's obviously not true. And to speak of the human domination of nature is not to say that all human beings play the same role or have the same responsibility. Environmental domination is a function of structural conditions that have their origins in human activities and express human agency. That's how it's human. But as Naomi Klein says, you, me, and ExxonMobil don't all play the same role here. Still less do the poor and politically marginalized people of, say, the Niger Delta, where so much oil has been violently extracted by companies like Exxon. So I'm going to talk in a minute about the importance of a pluralized and differentiated understanding of responsibility in this context that allows us to hold the right people responsible in the right ways for the right things, and that avoids blaming people for things they couldn't help or didn't have the power to stop. But I'm going to bracket that for a moment. So the human, in the human domination of nature, is a highly variegated category, and it's variegated in ways that matter a lot for what I'm calling earthly politics. But still, even though there are real, important, powerful differences of privilege and power among people in connection with environmental domination, both in terms of the harms that are suffered and in terms of responsibility for it, still the absence of robust institutional constraints and protections for nature makes Earth others systematically vulnerable to all of us who are human, however we're positioned relative to one another. And given how widely the structural conditions of environmental domination shape the basic terms of modern life today, for all of us, human and non-human, and human across the full spectrum of social hierarchies, given that, it's fair to say that we're all in need of emancipation, meaning the liberation of nature from human domination and the liberation of human beings from a way of life that's at once, although in very different ways, at once exploitative and exploited, complicit and entrapped. Earthly politics is a pathway to that kind of liberation. It's about inventing new kinds of political community that treats non-human others as members rather than as things whose sole function is to be used by members. Because politics is in part a domain of shared decision-making for the purpose of guiding the collective use of power, human beings have a distinctive role to play in earthly politics. Our ability to deliberate and communicate and coordinate with one another, and our capacity for norm-responsive choices. All this enables us to take on certain political responsibilities that just aren't feasible for other kinds of beings and things, at least so far as we know right now. But the fact that only people can deliberate with others in the ways that are now required for a political assembly to make decisions about the collective use of power, that doesn't make it right for only human well-being to count in this deliberation. So earthly politics is about making nature count, and this requires changing the structure of how human power flows. And that's why stewardship, as an ethical practice of ecological care, why it's not enough. It leaves human power unreconstructed. And so it makes non-human beings and things essentially dependent on the kindness of strangers in their interactions with us. But the kindness of strangers has never been an adequate check on domination. When we're serious about protecting people from domination, we force the issue. We give them rights against the arbitrary power of others. We set constraints. We make laws to constrain how power can operate. And we use the coercive force of the state to make people comply. Now, that doesn't always work, that's for sure. State-based and institutional checks on power are not sufficient to prevent domination, but they're necessary for it. And their necessity makes ecological emancipation a political project and not something that can be achieved through ethics alone. We need earthly politics. But what makes earthly politics earthly? Well, two aspects of earthly politics are important here. The structural limitation of human power as it bears on Earth's non-human parts, and the political incorporation of non-human well-being. And two modes of earthly politics are needed to make that possible: institutions and activism. So I'm going to talk about these aspects and modes of earthly politics together. Earthly politics combines checks on human power with formal mechanisms for representing non-human well-being. And it combines this with political activism that resists arbitrary power and exploitation and advocates for non-human beings and things. Establishing institutional constraints on human power in relation to nature is partly about having a robust regulatory frameworks that protect non-human animals and Earth systems. But it's not only about that. It includes changing the structure and flows of human power by deconsolidating it across the full range of its forms, political, but also cultural and economic. So for instance, a company that's too big to fail is also too big to be reliably checked by states and citizens, which leaves both people and nature vulnerable to arbitrary power and exploitation. So reversing neoliberal policies that abet the large-scale consolidation of economic power and that minimize oversight is going to be an important part or aspect of earthly politics. Efforts to do what J.K. Gibson Graham described as pluralizing the economy are also important. That is through the incorporation of small-scale and non-capitalist forms of production and exchange. This is another way of deconsolidating economic power by multiplying the sites and forms of economic activity that are open to us. So in the environmental context, things like farmers markets and community-supported agriculture arrangements offer alternative economic frameworks that reduce the role and therefore the power of large corporations in both the production and the exchange of food. So we need to make them more accessible to people with low incomes. But if we can do that, they offer an example of pluralizing the economy and deconsolidating economic power. Or we could think about the decentralized energy networks emerging in many places around the world today with wind and solar power. In transition towns and other sites of local energy production, communities take charge of both the production and the distribution of electricity in ways that, as Ram Kohl's puts it, generate alternative flows of power, both electrical power and political power. These alternative flows can help release communities, as he puts it, from the mega powers that proliferate circulations of fossil fuels. Transition towns then are another way of constraining human power in relation to non-human beings and things and people. They combine institutions and activism. Earthly politics will also combine constraints on human power with a framework of political representation that incorporates more than human others. This includes mechanisms for fully representing non-human beings and things, or for more formally representing non-human beings and things in decision-making bodies, from city councils to state and legislative assemblies. Along these lines, Robin Eckersley has offered a political trusteeship model for representing non-human species in places like legislatures and city councils. And Andrew Dobson talks about proxy representation for parts of nature by deputies elected, he suggests, from the Environmental Sustainability Lobby. Others have pressed for non-human representation across a wider range of human decision-making groups, from municipal land planning councils to governance boards of various professions and public services like the police or emergency services or the professions of law and medicine or urban planning and social services. So, what if the Providence City Council had a seat for the Narragansett Bay and its watershed? The idea is to build into a very wide range of human decision-making bodies institutional mechanisms that in effect force people to attend to non-human well-being in political decision-making. Because rights can serve the goals of both political incorporation and the limitation of power, earthly politics makes a place for animal and earth rights alongside human rights. Rights like these are beginning to be recognized in both legislative contexts and court decisions. The German Constitution, for instance, incorporates provisions for animal rights that are intended, it says, to protect the life and well-being of animals as fellow creatures. Ecuador's 2008 Constitution includes even broader protections for what it calls the rights of nature as a whole. Specifically, Article 71 establishes that nature has the right to exist, persist, maintain, and regenerate its vital cycles. And Article 72 provides nature with the right to restoration from environmental damage. In the last few years, courts in India and Australia and New Zealand have recognized certain rights for rivers intended to protect them from human overuse and pollution. And closer to home, in 2014, the city of Toledo, Ohio, passed the Lake Erie Bill of Rights that established rights for the lake against pollution and allowed residents of the city of Toledo, human residents of the city of Toledo, to file lawsuits on the lake's behalf. Well, rights are admittedly very imperfect mechanisms. I mean, they've never been enough to eliminate domination among people, and they've sometimes or maybe often occluded existing dominations and even been used to abet them. Macarena Gomez-Barras's work has shown how those earth rights that I mentioned in Bolivia and Ecuador have been frequently co-opted and inverted and ignored. And yet if rights are and other institutional mechanisms are insufficient, they're also necessary. A world without institutionally entrenched constraints on power and without entitlements to inclusion, that's a world of domination. And even when they seem to fail, or even when they really have failed, even then, animal and earth rights have sometimes been catalysts for transformation by articulating new public values and collective aspirations, and by inspiring activism on behalf of both nature and people. Macarena's account of environmental activists in Ecuador shows this too, how both human rights and earth rights, though never perfectly instantiated, often in important ways failing, how they've often also provided aspirational ideals that have helped fuel resistance to environmental domination. So I see them as examples of earthly politics. The limitations of institutional mechanisms like rights and political representation, in other words, should lead us not to reject them, but to pursue them in a reflexive way that's always alive to how they can fall short and go wrong, and that's ready to revise in light of what we come to learn. And that links institutional mechanisms like rights and representation to extra-institutional mobilizations and movements and activist forms of engagement aimed at correcting institutional failures and more generally at making non-human well-being count. So the idea here is not to pin all our hopes on some fixed or predefined or specific set of rights or institutional mechanisms, but to pursue in a reflexive and responsive way what Sue Donaldson and Will Kymlicka call a commitment to constructing certain kinds of ongoing relationships with more than human others, relationships that protect nature and people from insufficiently constrained human power and that are responsive in decision-making to their well-being. The new relationships of earthly politics will be quite diverse, and they can't be fully specified in advance. There's some common threads for sure, but how they'll play out in practice can't be fully specified. I mean, how they play out in practice will depend on how Earth's human and non-human parts make community in different places. Every community of earthly politics will be distinctive because no two ecosystems, including the peoples within them, no two are quite the same. In addition to institutional changes and activist mobilizations, practicing earthly politics involves the cultivation of some new human sensibilities. You could call them new sensibilities or new dispositions, or you could even call them new virtues. And I'm going to highlight two in particular before I close. The first is political respect for nature, and the second is eco-responsibility. So political respect for nature means acknowledging that non-human beings and things count, that they deserve to be treated according to standards of right, that there are principled limitations on how human power may be exercised in relation to them. It's similar in this way to respect for persons. In the context of democratic citizenship, to exercise political respect for persons is to treat others, in Kant's famous formulation, as always also as ends in themselves and never merely as the means to our own ends. It means acknowledging the normative force of others' standing, the irreducibility of their existence as exceeding their use value to us. It means constraining our inclination to subject them to the unbounded force of our own desires and perspectives and being responsive to their well-being alongside our own. So political respect for nature is like that. It combines self-restraint with responsiveness to the well-being of non-human others. And like respect for persons, it opens the door to the enlargement and enrichment of the self and the community through new forms of relationality. It's worth emphasizing that respectful relations are not always harmonious ones. Ecosystems are often violent places, and our relationships with Earth others regularly involve conflict. To live on the Earth is inevitably to consume, to transform, and to destroy. Even the most respectful and sustainable way of life couldn't get around that. So respect for nature doesn't mean the end of conflict, nor does it preclude the defense of basic human interests. It allows for us to provide for our own well-being, even when that requires certain kinds of damage to non-human nature. What it rules out is the unreflective degradation of nature for the purpose of satisfying endless consumerist desires in the boundless pursuit of profit and power. Political respect for nature asks us to bring a more discriminating sensibility to the pursuit of human well-being and to pair it with attunement to the well-being of nature. Along with political respect for nature, earthly politics calls for a new kind of responsibility. Our current conceptions of responsibility tend to treat individual intentionality and control as preconditions of responsibility, in the sense that we only really hold you fully responsible for something if you meant to do it and if you had control over what happened. But this way of thinking about responsibility is at odds with the basic structure of many environmental problems, in which people often contribute to damage without intending to do it or controlling their effects. Earthly politics includes then a new repertoire of responsibility that distinguishes between three forms or kinds of responsibility. Responsibility as culpability, and responsibility as accountability, and responsibility as responsiveness. This plurality enables us to differentiate among types and degrees of responsibility for environmental domination. So responsibility as culpability, thinking first about that, it's suited to cases of environmental damage where a particular agent, whether it's a person or a corporation or a state, where some agent really does know the damage that they're causing and really does have the ability to do otherwise. So Shell Oil is culpable for the environmental damage it's caused by its extractivist practices in the Niger Delta and for the harm to the Ogoni people that's gone with it. Eco-responsibility as accountability is different. It gives us a measure of responsibility for any harm to which we contribute, even when it's unintentional, and even when we lacked control over the outcome. We're accountable in this sense for the often indirect and unconscious parts that we play in things like climate change or species extinctions or pollution. But in contrast to culpability, holding somebody accountable for a harm in this sense doesn't imply blame or justify punishment. So take a woman who has to commute by car every day to put food on the table for her kids. And she doesn't really deserve to be blamed for her carbon emissions and the role they play in climate change. In the same way that we reasonably blame Shell Oil for what they've done in the Niger Delta. No, accountability in this context involves something different. It means acknowledging the harm, making a clear-eyed assessment of the causal dynamics in play, taking honest stock of our contributions, and doing what we can to remediate our effects going forward. And that last part, doing what we can to remediate our effects going forward, that includes an obligation to work for changes in the broader conditions that shape our harmful but unintended effects. So, for instance, if I'm thinking about my accountability in the context of climate change, you could say my responsibility maybe includes switching to LED light bulbs, but it's also going to be about joining together with my neighbors to advocate for a cleaner power plant in our area and electing public officials who support renewable energy development or who are willing to tax excessive consumption at higher rates or things like that. In other words, the responsibility to change my effects going forward requires me to work with others to help create new conditions of action for all of us, conditions that will allow us to avoid reproducing those same environmental harms and perpetuating environmental domination into the future. A third form of eco-responsibility involves responsiveness to harm and to the legitimate needs of those affected by it, whether or not you had a role in producing it. So in contrast to both culpability and accountability, responsibility as responsiveness doesn't presuppose any causal connection at all between you and the harm. But it does assume that you have some capacity to make change going forward or to contribute to making change going forward. So think about Peter Singer's famous example of a child who's fallen into a pond and is drowning, and you happen to be walking by, and most people would say, yes, the responsible thing to do in that case, even though you didn't have anything to do with that kid being in the water, is to help her if you can. That's responsibility as responsiveness. So this three-dimensional way of thinking about and practicing responsibility is including culpability and accountability and responsiveness. This lets us make sense of the different roles that different people have in context of environmental damage and domination. It expands the scope of responsibility for most of us, but it does this without attaching all responsibility to blame, and without treating all people as equally responsible or responsible in the same ways. The sensibility or the virtue of eco-responsibility is then as important to earthly politics as political respect for nature is. Okay, so I've talked about two aspects of earthly politics, the limitation of human power and the political incorporation of non-human parts of nature, and two modes of earthly politics, institutions and activism, and two virtues of earthly politics, political respect for nature and eco-responsibility. My thought is that taken together, they point us to new ways of structuring and contesting human power and to new forms of political community that could offer some alternative pathways away from environmental domination and toward more freer ways of life for all of us, human and non-human both. And I want to come back now, just by way of finally closing, back again to Macarena's work, because she's written so powerfully about eco-activists in extractivist zones who are working to imagine and create what she calls life otherwise. Because I think in the end, this is maybe the best way of saying what earthly politics is all about. The precarious, always unfinished business of making better, freer political communities across all the assemblages that we find ourselves in, human and more than human both. Earthly politics is the business of making and sustaining life otherwise.